the New Life podcast. Today we will talk about how God can take evil in the world and turn it to good. Now, before we dive into the topic, we're going to start doing icebreakers.
Yep.
And hopefully...
Fun icebreakers.
Yeah, hopefully they'll be fun.
If you don't like it, just let us know.
Yeah.
And we'll probably keep doing it.
Yeah, we'll just do it anyways. But, I mean, you can also answer the icebreaker if you want to.
Yeah, down in the comments, just tell us whatever the question is for the week. Tell us what your answer would be, and that would be fun to kind of share with each other.
See how different they are.
Mm-hmm.
So this week's icebreaker is a little more open-ended. It says, if you had to eat one meal every day for the rest of your life, what would it be?
What would it be?
What would it be? I thought about this for a second, and I'm sure that once I commit to this, I would regret it instantly. But I'm going with tacos.
Tacos. I knew you were going to say
Tacos are just a good staple.
We have tacos all the time, and they're good. And I could eat tacos.
We actually have taco salad more, but...
That's the same idea.
Same idea. In a bowl.
I could probably have tacos every day. See, mine, when I was thinking about it, I just thought of so many different, like, I could probably have, but again, like what you're saying, I would probably regret it.
As soon as I'm committed, I'm like, I'm sick of
but
this.
If I had to choose one, I would. What do you think I'd pick?
What you probably pick, like, I want to say pizza, but I actually don't think you like pizza that much.
No, not pizza.
Steak.
No, but that was on the list.
That was on the list. I'm not sure then.
Goulash.
Really?
Yep.
You don't even like pasta that much. You would get sick of it.
No, I love goulash. Why? It's because you can reheat it and it tastes even better when you reheat it. Goulash is good.
See, at least with tacos, I feel like there's enough variety of like how people make a taco. Like if I go to Taco Bell and I get a taco versus if I go to like Macades and get a taco, those are completely different.
Yeah, I could get goulash from. I've had so many different types of goulash. They're all different.
Okay.
Yeah, some are good, some aren't as good.
I think your answer is a bad answer.
I also put on here biscuits and gravy.
See, like you picked. There's like no diversity in that.
But I didn't want to pick that one because again, I think I would get sick and tired of biscuits and gravy, and I'd probably get fat.
You don't think that's gonna happen with goulash?
No, goulash is a very nutritious meal. Okay. Tacos are not.
Tacos have more.
They're high in sodium.
Tacos have more of the food pyramid than your goulash does.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah. You get dairy, you get the vegetables, you get the protein, you get the grain.
You get all that in goulash.
No.
Yeah, huh?
No.
Yeah, you do.
I don't believe it.
Maybe not dairy. That's like the only one. But anyway, so on this week we're talking about, like you said, God taking evil and turning to good. Or in essence, maybe like, what on earth are you guys talking about? In essence, we're talking about suffering and evil in the world and what happens. What type of perspective should we have when we cross those roads? Because we all cross those roads. There's nobody that's not gonna face evil and suffering in this life. It's everywhere. Because we live in a world that is, we all have a sin nature that contributes to this, but we also live in a world where it's hostile to the things of God. We live in a world where people just do evil and hurtful things. And what happens when those things happen is suffering and pain and heartache. Those things follow evil. So we're talking about evil, but suffering comes after evil. So really, a believer has to struggle with this idea of suffering and what to do with it. And then what we're going to find out during this episode is that God has all of that in his hands. Mm-hmm. It's not something that we're just left here and what do we do? What's going to happen? We're going to find out that God can turn evil into good, into his purposes, into work the good for those who love him, which brings us to how we're going to start this out, which is Romans 8:28, which says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes. Now that should be a comforting verse.
Yeah.
Like that should really, it should comfort us in a way that God's always looking out for us, right? Even the bad things that happen in our life, the suffering, the pain, God's still looking out for us. He's He's seeking out the good for us according to his purposes, which means that they're ultimately good, right? They're not just good for me, they're good for all things. And I think sometimes we feel like, oh, it's not really that good for me, but we don't see what's happening in the distance. We don't see what God's doing for somebody else because of the evil and the suffering in my life. That God can do something so amazing, is God can turn that evil and suffering into the good for other people as well, not just for myself, not just a learning moment, because that's what we kind of jump to, which does happen, but even like real blessings and real just real goodness for not only myself, but those that are actually, maybe even those I'll never even know. But God can do that because God sees all things and he knows all things.
Well, and I feel like that's so reassuring, because I think there's this, like, sometimes this false idea that as a Christian, like, everything's going to be like rainbows and butterflies, and like you're never going to go through a hard time. It's just going to be easy, smooth sailing. And that's just not the reality of life, honestly. And like, Christians, just like anyone else, are going to have those highs and lows. And when those hard times come, like, it's reassuring to know that it's not just for nothing. Where I feel like when you're not a Christian, you start to be like, okay, well, why is this happening? Like, why am I going through this? And you can't necessarily see the, like, good that's going to come out of it. And as a Christian, like, we know that there is good that's going to come out of it. Even if, like you said, it's way down the road, maybe it's the good for someone else. Like, we have that reassurance through the verse that we just read.
And, you think about, like, so, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute then. Is if God, maybe you're asking, well, does God cause suffering? Does God cause evil to happen? No, he doesn't, right? God created the world perfect. It's excellent. But because sin had creeped in, because we were tempted and we fell at the beginning of the world, now we kind of all have this sin nature, that this kind of this mind that is bent towards sin. And that's where things get a little mucky, right? It gets muddy and nasty, because we start to do things that are bad and evil. And then you ask the Lord, well, what does God do with that? And what we're going to get into today is we're going to know exactly what God did with that, and what he is still doing with the evil and the suffering, and sin and all those things in the world. And I think of so many different examples in the Bible of this kind of, which we're going to talk about one main one, probably the one that everyone jumps to, which is the story of Joseph, but there's so many more of this idea of something evil that is happening, suffering that's happening, something hard that's happening, and God turning it around. So you see, like, the one that jumped out to me was the story of Moses. And in Moses' story, you see this evil that is happening to the people in Israel. They're slaves, they're in bondage to the Pharaoh, and they're being mistreated and just a big burden on them. And then Moses comes along, and without going through all the details on how all this happens, we eventually get to the point where God comes to him in a burning bush. Even Moses himself does evil, and that's why he leaves. But God takes all that, the evil of Pharaoh, even the evil that Moses did by killing the Egyptians. He took that and got to the point where, through the plagues and then the Red Sea, all that, and delivered the people from the bondage of slavery. And I think this it's comforting to know that if God can do something like that, if God can take thousands and thousands of people and walk them out of their slavery, walk them out of the evil, and then bless the people through it. Now, granted, you may be like, well, what about all this other stuff? Well, that's because of sin and evil, and there's consequences to those things. And there's consequences to the things Moses even did, by killing the Egyptians. Who knows what that story would have looked like if that's not the route Moses would have taken? Would it have been easier, or what? Or would Moses have ever went? It's like there's so many questions when it comes to that story. But what I do know is the final product, which is God's purpose, was accomplished, even in spite of the evil and the suffering and the pain that was happening to the people. and that even maybe the people were doing, God did it in spite of what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we even see stories in the New Testament. So when I was thinking about this, I thought of the story of the prodigal son, and how in that story you see, I mean, a lot of this was decisions that he made.
Mm-hmm.
So he decided he wanted his inheritance. He decided he wanted the money now to do his own thing. And so he got what he wanted. And I feel like in the worldly standpoint, you're like, great, he's got money. Like, what could go wrong?
Mm-hmm.
But we see him quickly just blow through that and start to see the consequences of him, like, kind of making his own path and doing things faster than they should have been done. I mean, he has no money by the end. He's literally living with the pigs, like,
Mm-hmm.
just down as down could be. But we see how God uses this moment to bring him back to his family.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously we see this as a picture of coming back to the Lord. But we see him just be reunited with his family, brought in with love, and shown just grace and mercy in that moment when in his head he was doing all the right things and he just wasn't doing it the way he should have done it.
Yeah. When you think about that story too, is that the Father or God is
Mm-hmm.
what the picture of Jesus is trying to show us. It doesn't make sense for him to be taken back after what he had did by asking for the inheritance and being like, I'm done being around here. Like, that's not the way things happen back then when it comes to like the inheritance and things like that. Once that happens, it's like, yeah, you're on your own, you got to figure it out. But that's not what the Father did, right? The Father took him back. God brought about good even in spite of the dumb things that we do and the evil that we do, and the suffering and pain we cause to other people and to ourselves. God still works that for good, though that we may have to live with the consequences here on earth depending on the things that we do. Everything has different levels of severity here on earth. Everything separates us from the Lord when it's sin, but there are just different consequences for those sins here on earth.
Now, before we move into Joseph's story at all, can you think of anything from your own life, like own experiences, that you feel like maybe are examples of God using?
I think there's so many different ones. They may seem small, but I think just, there's when I think about like my own life when it comes to like before Christ and just the evil that I was doing, really bad stuff. But God used that moment to draw me to his Son and brought about salvation to me, even though I didn't deserve those things. And then I see where I'm at now, all the good that has happened, because God turned that evil that I was doing there and brought good about because of those things, right? He drew me, like I was done with that life and he drew me from it. And then there's just so many other different examples. Can you think of anything?
I think for me, when I was first thinking about this, the first thing that comes to mind, probably just because of the recency, is our miscarriage experience. I mean, obviously, that alone you can be like, okay, that's not good. That's a bad thing. And I feel like that moment was a moment that could have brought a lot of separation from God. Just, with the questioning of like, why is this happening? Like, we were faithful in prayer. Like, you just start to have these doubts. But instead, God was able to use it as a moment to draw me, and I obviously also think you, closer to him, but also like gave this opportunity to have a way to relate to other people, whether Christian or non-Christian, who either have gone through the similar thing or maybe one day will, and being able to use this experience as a testimony of God's faithfulness. And obviously now, like, knowing that we're expecting, like, there's more to that story than just the moment, but using it to just point to God's goodness, even though, like, when you hear the word miscarriage, it just instantly brings bad.
And then, so that brings us to where we're going to kind of camp out for just a little bit, which is the story of Joseph. And when you think of evil and things done to a man, this, in spite of him not doing really anything to deserve these things, you think really of Joseph and how the Lord can turn something bad in the beginning to redemption and deliverance and forgiveness and so many amazing things at the end. And though during the time through this journey, you may be wondering like, well, what's going on? Why does all these things keep happening? Am I going to be stuck in this suffering? Am I going to be stuck in this evil in my life? And this story is an encouragement to us because we know that there's an end at some point. God will bring good about good out of it at some point in that journey. Though it may last for a while, we can be reassured that God will redeem and deliver and forgive or whatever needs to happen out of the good in the end when his good purpose needs to be finished and revealed or whatever when it comes to those things.
I think that's important too, because like Joseph's story too, I think is just a good perspective of sometimes it's not going to be an instant something bad's happening, something good's going to happen.
Yeah, and sometimes
it takes a while.
And like so, we'll kind of summarize it a little bit because we don't have time to read chapter.
We'd be here all day.
We're going to be here for a minute if we're trying to actually go through the whole story of Joseph. So we'll summarize it a little bit. But what we find in this story is that it's not one evil. It's multiple evils that are happening to this man. And you'd be like, it's a roller coaster of just situations that are happening that could really knock a man down and really cause him to question, well, is God even looking out for me? Does God care about me? Why is all this happening to me? The questions people ask all the time. Yeah. Why, right? Why is a big question, not only in the Christian life, but in life in general. Why is all this happening? Why does evil happen? Why does this happen? And so on and so forth. But here we see at the beginning of Joseph's story is he's a man who has dreams, right? He has these dreams. He tells his brothers this dream that he had. Well, what's this dream? This dream is that basically there was going to be a moment where his brothers and the stars and the moon, they all bow down to him. The brothers didn't like that.
Obviously, that did not go over
being
well.
Being the young guy, the young kid, the young brother.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense, and especially in Jewish culture, it didn't make sense for you to bow down to the youngest. That was reserved for the oldest. The inheritance, all that was reserved for the oldest. But here we see, okay, Joseph has this dream. He seems highly favored by his father. He gets this beautiful coat of many colors.
Yeah.
Right.
Things were not really set up for his success at the
and
beginning.
many people question whether or not Joseph was arrogant and those things. And you could question those things. Maybe he didn't go about it the best way. No matter what was the outcome, it definitely shouldn't have been.
He didn't deserve what happened.
Yeah. So his brothers conspired to kill him at first. Then one brother talks him out of it. So what they do is they sold him into slavery. And so he goes into slavery, and he ends up going to this guy named Potiphar, which was like Pharaoh's guard, and like I said, without going into a bunch of details, and he's doing pretty good there. He's kind of getting some position and some power, even as a slave, and God seems to be blessing them. Well, what happens is that Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him. Potiphar's wife wants him, and Joseph's like, nope, not gonna happen.
Yeah.
And so she falsely accuses him of him doing something, and so he gets thrown in prison, where he ends up interpreting some dreams. Some things happen there, and basically he gets recognized by Pharaoh. Well, the reason why he gets recognized by Pharaoh is because he has another dream, or he interprets a dream of Pharaoh's, and basically comes to the conclusion that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh hears this, obviously understands that Joseph has this amazing gift, and puts him kind of second in command of everything.
Up the ranks
right? He becomes basically like vice president of Egypt. He becomes the cupbearer, in essence, to the Pharaoh, and it's crazy to think about this journey for a minute. So he goes to, like I said, we went through it quick, but he goes from just the youngest kid.
Mm-hmm.
And your brothers, your brother. It's not like a mystery. Your brothers sold you into slavery. I couldn't even grapple with that idea. Like, I couldn't imagine being in Joseph's shoes at that moment. It's all over.
Yeah.
But what I find amazing about this is that Joseph never really seems to lose faith. He never seems to lose hope.
Mm-hmm.
He just kind of keeps going and doing what God calls him to do, or at least trying to live a righteous way.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us to these verses that we're going to read here that I think are like the pivotal moment in all the story of Joseph to understand this idea of suffering and pain and evil in the world and what God can do with it. So Genesis 45, 5-8, Savannah's going to read what that is.
So verses 5-8 say, "And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt."
And then Genesis 50, 19-20 says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.'" And here we see, so these two passages that we just read show us the perspective that Joseph had. He didn't have a negative perspective. He didn't say, "How dare you, brothers? Now that you've come to Egypt and now that you're here asking for food, because you have none, because this, again, 7 years of famine's going on, right? You're hungry." They go to the place where they're like, well, Egypt is going to be the most likely place to have something to eat. So that's where they go. And what do they find? Joseph knows it right away. Joseph,
they don't even realize
my brothers. But they don't realize it. So without going through all the details, something like he kind of tricks them, and in essence, like basically like pretending not to be their brother, and basically gets to the point where he reveals it to them, right? "Ha, I'm Joseph, I'm your brother."
Surprise.
And then they're afraid, right? They're scared because they're starting to remember, what did we do to our brother, right? We lied to our dad about what we did to him. Now that's all coming back to us. Well, what they're thinking is, oh, he's going to have us killed, right? Or sold into slavery too, or a consequence was going to happen. But Joseph doesn't do that. Rather, he forgives his brothers, and then has that perspective that we just read, right? That God was sending me ahead for this very moment. God used your evil, like he's talking to his brothers, in paraphrase for sure. God used your evil to bring about the good, the saving of many lives. And sometimes that's a hard thing to see.
Yeah, right? Joseph's perspective is definitely not the common perspective of most.
and really, that's God-given perspective. And what we find out in the Christian life is sometimes we have to ask the Lord, give me a God-given perspective, right? Because, from a worldly perspective, that's hard to see. That's hard to understand and hard to grapple with. And many times we would want to retaliate in those moments. But Joseph doesn't do that because he's been given a God-given perspective. And that perspective was that God sent me ahead to save you. Even though you intended it for harm and for evil, God intended all of this for good, to bring about his good purposes, his will, to save a remnant of the people of Israel. And again, like I said, that's hard to see as a believer because God didn't reveal all this to Joseph.
Yeah.
He didn't say while Joseph was in the caravan headed for slavery, he didn't say, well, don't worry, Joseph, I'm going to use you to save many lives. At least it doesn't seem that way, not recorded in the Bible. He didn't get to Potiphar's house and being accused, thrown in prison. And God's like, well, don't worry, I'm going to use you for the saving of many lives. It wasn't until the moment happened that I believe that Joseph realized that all this was for the Lord. All this, even the evil that had started all of this. God brought about something so amazing. God brought about salvation. God brought about deliverance and redemption through Joseph for the people who committed the evil. And I find that bizarre.
Yeah.
Because, again, like I said, from our perspective, from a worldly perspective, why would Joseph not do something? I'm not saying he would kill him or, throw him into slavery, but...
Well, it's like he's in this position of power where he could do anything.
Rub their nose in it or something,
yeah.
Right? Like, oh, see, told you, that this was all going to happen. Remember my dream. Now, we should remember the dream because, again, that just reminds us that God keeps his promises. Yeah. But rather, he used it for much more encouraging and uplifting and an amazing moment, as he says, don't be afraid, because what God was doing was all this to save many people's lives. Mm-hmm. And what I find also amazing is that not only it was for Israel's life, but even those in Egypt. Mm-hmm. Even they were benefits of even the evil that was happening from Joseph's story from the beginning. Mm-hmm. They didn't realize it. Yeah. And maybe, in fact, most of them, maybe not everybody in Egypt, but the majority of Egypt wouldn't have cared about this God. Mm. Right? They had other gods. They had, a bunch of gods. Pharaoh was their god, right? They wouldn't have thought 2 cents about God, but that didn't stop God from bringing about good from the evil that was happening. And I think that brings us to this parallel, because you might be asking, well, what does this story really have to do with me? Mm-hmm. Why does it matter to me that God turned the evil in Joseph's life to good for his brothers, good for Joseph, and good for the Egyptians? Because when we think about this story in parallel to Christ, it's a huge parallel, mm-hmm. right? There's so many similarities. So when you think of Christ and you think of Joseph's story, what do you feel like are the comparisons in that story?
I think the first thing that jumps to my mind is the false accusations. I mean, in both stories you see with Joseph, you have the moment with Potiphar's wife where he's being falsely accused for things that he didn't do, which then gets him thrown into jail, where he's able to sort of start interpreting these dreams to get him in a position where he is able to make a difference. Yeah. But then the same thing happens with Christ. He is falsely accused of crimes he's not committing that end up leading him towards the cross for this ultimate calling that God has already established. But you see how both these false accusations end up leading these men onto paths for a bigger picture for all people, not just them.
Yeah, and so that's like the big thing that jumps out to me when you think about Christ, is that the Old Testament mirrors the New Testament in a lot of ways, and that's what you kind of see in Joseph's story. You see Joseph is it's like a picture of Christ, the one who's to come, the Messiah, and that God was going to do a similar thing for his people, for those that love him. He's going to bring about this ultimate good, which is salvation for his people, even the people that didn't deserve it, even the people that committed the evil. And again, you think about just Jesus and just the brutality of the cross and the evil that had happened while he was taking the cross and then being put on the cross, and the soldiers mocking them, and the people in the crowds mocking him and spitting on him, and just really just evil and suffering and pain that you think about when you think about the cross. But then you think about, okay, well, what was it all for? Why did Jesus go through all the evil? Why did Jesus go through all the pain and suffering? It was because God had an ultimate good in store, right? Mm-hmm. His purpose was to bring salvation to the world, and that was going to come through the evil and the pain and the suffering that happened to Christ, and God was going to use that for our good, which is salvation. And you think about okay, you think, well, maybe you're thinking, well, I haven't done anything wrong. Well, you have. The Bible says we have. Yeah. The Bible says we've all fallen short of the glory of God. We've all sinned. If you say you haven't sinned, you make God out to be a liar. So many verses that point to that we need salvation. Every person in this world needs salvation, and that God loved us so much that he sent his son to die for us so that we don't perish but we have everlasting life. And you think about the good of who just God is to do something that amazing. And then you see, like I said, the parallel between Joseph and Christ, Joseph and Jesus, is that Joseph didn't have any reason to forgive his brothers, didn't have any reason to bring salvation for the people of Israel, because all that they ever did to him was do evil and sin and punish and whatever. But that's exactly what happened to Jesus. And we don't deserve to be forgiven. We don't deserve to have salvation. In fact, the Bible says we deserve the wrath of God. We deserve punishment. Those are the things that we deserve, but God gave us what we don't deserve, right? He gave us grace. He gave us the amazing grace. He gave us salvation, deliverance, redemption. The same thing that's in Joseph's story for his brothers. And this shows us that we're just like Joseph's brothers. We deserved what the world would have gave Joseph's brother, which was consequences and pain and suffering. But God didn't give us that. God gave us salvation. And that should bring peace to our life. That should bring comfort and joy and just goodness in our life, to know that the ultimate evil that was ever done brought about the most amazing thing, which is salvation. And that's what we should know from Christ's story in our life, is that Christ took on all the evil of the world, and God used that to bring about salvation for his people, for those that love him.
Well, and that's the amazing thing too, is we just see in both these stories how God took both Joseph and Christ and took them from their place of suffering and even elevated them in a sense to be able to do what they needed to do for the people, for us. I mean, Joseph was taken from prison and, like you said, basically became vice president for Pharaoh. And then we see Christ, he's on the cross and he was taken to the right hand of God. And it's just amazing to see how God moved in those moments to take this suffering and then ultimately use it to bring these men up to a spot where they could do what they needed to do for God's purpose, and ultimately that was salvation.
And when you think about what you just talked about, is that it's a good remembrance for us that when we're going through suffering, going through evil in our life, when bad things are happening to us, is that Christ is going to bless us through it, as long as we remain faithful to him. As long as we're trusting in him, as long as we're loving him, God will bless us through it. Whether that's peace and comfort and joy through those moments of hardships, but even the Lord can do much more amazing things in our life. He does those things which are amazing, but God can even do much more than that. Maybe things we never see. Things like, again, like I said, Joseph didn't know that this was going to happen until he gets to Egypt, right? Until he interprets the dream that this famine's going to happen. He didn't know a famine was going to happen until he interprets this dream. And he didn't know it was going to save his people, like that his brothers were going to show up, and all that happened. That's the same thing with us in our life. Just because God doesn't reveal all the goodness that is coming out of our life, the ripple effect that can sometimes happen, doesn't mean that God still is not doing it. In fact, many times we just need to trust the word of God. And God will bring, like the verse we said, God brings the good about the good for those that love him, according to his good purposes. Like that should just be that should be a sounding board for us. That if we're struggling with the evil that's happening in our life, why this is happening, that we can go back to that verse and realize, Lord, I know you're going to bring good about it. I know you're going to bring good out of it. Even if it's not for me, Lord, I know you're going to bring it for somebody else. And hopefully, that helps us walk this road of evil and suffering in our life.
It should almost bring a peace to a sense, like that that God's got it all under control.
And in that should produce perseverance in our life. And perseverance can be tough in this life because sometimes the hits just keep on coming.
That's the one fruit of the Spirit where even kids are like, can't do that.
Yeah.
Need help with that.
Yeah. And you know, when you get perseverance, and or when when you're struggling with perseverance, when you want to give up and throw in the towel, you see this kind of hardship that's in our life, and you're like, well, I'd rather just stay down. Mm-hmm. Well, the Lord wants us to keep going. Joseph never stopped. He never stopped going. Christ never stopped. Christ kept going even when he didn't want to. Even when he said, Lord, if it's all possible, let this cup pass from me. But not my will, but your will be done. That should be our attitude. That should be the way that we govern our life, is by God's will, and be willing sometimes to walk through the evil, walk through the suffering of life. Because you know that the Lord's going to bring about his will, which is always good in your life. And though, again, perseverance is hard, when you remember, again, like what we talked about just a minute ago, that I've done evil, but God gave me good. That should produce perseverance in our life, to know that if God did the most amazing thing in salvation, sin, removed it from my life, then why do I not think he can remove the suffering and the pain and the evil that's been done to me in my life? God can for sure do that. God can restore all things. God can redeem all things to those who love him and those who trust in him. And we're all going to go through evil.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to figure out how to wiggle your way around suffering.
If you figure it out, let us know.
It's just not going to happen.
It's just part of life.
And so you've got to figure out, okay, what am I going to do with kind of this? What am I going to do with evil? What am I going to do with suffering? Am I going to let it take me down? Or am I going to allow it to motivate me to press on, because I know that God's going to do something about it?
Yeah, that's what I think is so pivotal, is as a Christian, like, these hard times are going to happen, but to have this mindset to be able to use these hard times as a moment to force yourself to rely on God, you're going to see so much good come out of that. Mm-hmm. You're going to see your faith grow. You're going to see, you're going to just know that God is your comfort, your strength, and your whole relationship with him will grow by taking these hard times and saying, okay, I can't change this on my own. Mm-hmm. I need God to be there to help me, and just completely give it all to him and trust him to, like we've said constantly throughout this episode, use these hard moments for his good and for the good of those around you.
Mm-hmm. And if you're like, there's no way God can bring about good from what is happening to me, then I would encourage you and challenge you to pray to the Lord and just ask the Lord to show you. Mm-hmm. Show you what God can really do, no matter the circumstances in life. Because we all have a choice on what we're going to do with evil and suffering. You're going to either let it knock you down, or you're going to allow it to push you to keep trusting and relying on the Lord, like you talked about. Because we all have a choice. None of us really, even though it's hard, I'm not saying it's not hard, it is hard. None of us really have a good excuse not to rely on the Lord in those moments of hardship and pain, because of what we already talked about, because of salvation in our life, because God has already done the biggest good in our life.
Yeah.
Despite the evil that we did to him, he brought about the biggest good in life, which is salvation for all people, for the whole world, for those who love him, for those who trust in him, trust in Jesus Christ. God gives eternal life, and that's something that can't be bought. It's not something that you can do good things to get. It's only a gift from the Lord, which even makes it more special, because it's not something to be earned, but rather it's given out of love and grace and mercy, because we didn't deserve it, and God knows we can't earn it. But God loved us so much that he wanted us to have that access to him, which is through Jesus Christ. So, if you want to become a more mature believer in your life, it starts with not just knowing this, knowing Romans 8:28.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing verse. It's when you start applying that to your life.
You have to live it out.
It's when you start, because again, you're going to go through those moments. Mm-hmm. And you're going to, when you start to realize, when you start to become a more mature believer, you start having more victories in those moments. Mm-hmm. Rather than knocked down and then get back up and you get knocked down again. No, you're staying up because you're relying on the Lord. Again, not that you're not going to get knocked down from time to time. The Lord still has grace and mercy and picks us back up into all those things. But we need more victories in our life. We need more times where we're living out the Bible rather than just knowing it and reading it or listening to it, but we're actually experiencing the scriptures. So you have any final thoughts?
I think just it's important to remember, and I'm sure most of us have heard this analogy, that suffering, you can think of it kind of like a fire, where when you have this perspective of trusting God and relying on God through these hard times, these moments of suffering can ultimately be used to just like refine your faith and make your faith stronger, to make your walk with the Lord stronger. And I think when you think about it like that, it can sometimes make it easier to get through those hard times as well, because you know that it's going to be an end to it. And once you get through it, if you've relied on the Lord through it, you're going to be stronger because of it. And you're going to have a testimony at the end of it that you can use to just continue to glorify God.
Yeah, exactly. I like that. Suffering does refine us. It does mold us. And there's so many moments in the New Testament where Paul or Peter talk about this idea of basically enduring the suffering. Because of that, because it refines us, because it shows the world the goodness of God and the mercy of God, and so many other different examples. But so that concludes our episode for this week. If you like this episode, go ahead and like and subscribe. Comment down below maybe how the Lord has helped you, has turned suffering in your life into good. Share those moments with us. We'd love to see what God has done in your life. And as always, thank you for watching the New Life Podcast.